Hello and welcome. This is track one, environmental, social, and governance. Better data insights enabling companies' ESG goals and ultimately to benefit society. I'm Mark Johnson, the track co-producer today. I'm Vice President of Fusion Alliance and also our Executive Leader of Strategic Data Management and Analytics. I also serve as the visionary co-founder and the editorial board chair for CDO magazine. Today, we have a great presentation on building a secure foundation for cloud data governance with CDMC. Mark Shainman, if I pronounced the name correctly, will be conducting the presentation. Let me share a little bit with you about Mark. Mark is a Senior Director of Data Governance Practice at Security. Before joining Security, he spent the last 18 years at Teradata, covering Teradata Vantage, as well as ecosystem management software, Teradata IntelliSphere, competitive programs at TerraMaster, and data management. As a part of Teradata's analytical ecosystem, Mark looks after the marketing, education, promotion, and strategy surrounding the uptake and usage of the Teradata Grid Query, App Center, Listener, Data Lab, Ecosystem Manager, Multi-System Viewpoint, Data Stream Architecture, Unity, Data Mover. Mark also had the role as Global Program Manager for Teradata's competitive programs, covering Oracle, IBM, Netezza, and SQL Server migrations, as well as Data Mart consolidation. He's also headed the team that developed, marketed, and sold Teradata's MDM solution. He's managed the global aspects of technology, strategy, positioning, and sales support surrounding numerous products and programs at Teradata. Prior to joining Teradata, he was a senior research analyst for Meta Group, specializing in database management systems for both online transaction processing systems and decision support architectures. Mark Shainman advised clients on a wide spectrum of database issues, including total cost of ownership, analysis, data mart consolidation, disaster recovery, replication, security, while assisting the core database product comparison and selection. And I'm shocked because he only looks 22. So obviously that's not true.
I'm 52. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All right, well, let me just get off the platform and give it to you.
Thank you. So today we're going to be talking about implementing best practices when it comes to cloud implementations and how to implement a practice that ensures that you have a secure cloud environment. As you can see, that I've had a wide array of jobs in my IT career, dealing with master data management, dealing with data streaming, dealing with deep analytics, data governance, etc. So I've been looking at this problem for a long period of time. So one of the problems that we see, especially at Security, and we see across the board within the industry, is the cloud has really disrupted how organizations deal with implementing best practices and managing security within their cloud environment. One of the problems that we used to deal with back in the day, especially with on-premises systems, was we had some shadow IT that would exist. But the shadow IT that we dealt with was maybe some data mart proliferation. Somebody would have an Access database under their desk, or they're running a little SQL Server database. But the problem now with the cloud is the ease of spinning up instances, and not just in a single cloud, but across multiple clouds, brings the benefit that organizations can see to time to value, but also the problem of more exposure within their environment. The ability for one of your users to easily spin up an instance, load some open source software, throw some data in it, and be analyzing that data, and you not even have insight into what's going on within that cloud environment. So we've also seen the problem of the exponential growth of data. And it's funny, because I remember like 15 years ago, I was talking about this exponential growth of data. But now within the cloud environment, with organizations facing so many more new applications and new ways that data is being generated, our data scientists now manipulating data, new data sets that they're creating, this problem has just become worse. And the scope of the data is not one that is just limited to a single cloud environment. It now spans multiple clouds. So this has been a problem that we've seen as an industry as a whole, organizations are facing. Like, how do I get my hands around all this complexity that exists within a cloud environment and actually implement the best practices that will protect me as an organization moving forward as I actually grow my cloud? So one of the organizations that actually got together and said, hey, how do we implement some best practices around cloud implementations and cloud growth was the EDM Council. And what actually is the EDM Council? It's really a global association that develops and promotes standards around best practices around data management. And lucky for us, we actually today have the president of the EDM Council, John, who is here. And I'm actually going to have him get up for a second and do a little introduction on the EDM Council. You want to hop up for a sec?
What's his name, by the way?
Oh, John Bottega, sorry. Sorry. John Bottega is the president of the EDM Council.
So thanks, Mark. I thought I had a shot at actually being in the audience and not having to present, but I guess I didn't get away with that. No, the council has been around now since 2005. I was fortunate in my career to be named the Chief Data Officer in 2006 at Citi, so the role of the CDO was just beginning. And industry was getting together and going, okay, what do we do with this new animal that's been created? How do we bring these people together? And that was the genesis of the council. We're a nonprofit, we're neutral. We bring smart people together. That's our special sauce. And I know you're going to talk about the CDMC in a moment. The CDMC was really members coming to us and going, okay, we have this emerging challenge, an opportunity in cloud. Can you bring your members together to do that? And that's, in essence, what we did. We brought 100 companies together to look at cloud implementation and protection of sensitive data through a framework of best practices. So we were absolutely blessed and thrilled to work with really smart people across all different aspects of, you see you have some names up there, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, IBM participated as well. We have over 350 companies now in the organization as members. 300 participated in this activity. It was an 18-month project, 45,000 man-hours put this together. So I don't want to steal Mark's thunder. You're going to explain it. But thank you for having me the opportunity to speak.
I wanted to at least the guy who was there on the ground creating this framework, John, was there to give a little introduction. Thank you.
Thanks.
And one thing is you know, security, the company that I'm a member of, is actually an executive board member of the CDMC. And the question is, you know, and John alluded to this, why was the CDMC actually created? The industry as a whole is really seeing challenges around technology, especially dealing with regulations, and planning challenges when they're actually moving into the cloud. One of the other problems a lot of organizations were facing is they're not just a single cloud organization. Their data systems and their applications span multiple clouds. And how do they actually deal with managing a framework that is not just in Amazon, not just in Google, not just in IBM, is in this multi-cloud environment, and in many cases, even hybrid cloud. So the objectives really were to define best practices. And that's why you know, he got together with all these companies and put it together. And really align some of these key controls to meet some of these regulatory obligations that all of our organizations are now facing and are continuing, new ones are continuing to roll out, of course, and are going to be facing more in the United States with new states rolling out more privacy laws as well. So there's actually 14 key controls that make up the CDMC framework, dealing with ones such as DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment, dealing with cataloging, dealing with classification of data. All of these 14 controls were put together so they could put together, as I stated earlier, a foundation for best practices when you're actually moving into the cloud and implementing your cloud environment. So we only have 30 minutes for this presentation today, so I can't go over all of the actual controls, but I'm just going to touch base on some of the highlights of some of the controls. So cataloging is one of the key controls, and the key control actually states that cataloging must be automated for all of the data at the point of creation or of ingestion, and it has to be consistent across all of the environments. So when you're really looking for a data catalog and implementing a cataloging solution, it should be one that automates the discovery of data that exists within the systems within your environment and actually catalogs those data sets. Of course, it has to be able to span multiple cloud environments when you're actually looking at cataloging. And dealing with on-premises systems as well and software as a service systems as well. Of course, one of the key things of the catalog when you're looking at this catalog that actually is giving insight into the data that exists within your environment is that it spans not only structured data, but also unstructured data as well. One of the things that interests me about cataloging is I'm from the old school. I remember when metadata management was us putting a bunch of data in Excel spreadsheets and then emailing it around to everybody, and that's the way that we dealt with metadata management. And when you're looking at cloud environments, and I talked about this earlier, and I alluded to it earlier, when you're dealing with these hyperscale environments that are now spanning multiple clouds, you cannot have a solution where your expectation is to monitor and manage the metadata that exists across all of your assets that exist within your cloud environment in a manual fashion with Excel spreadsheets. It just can't be done. So organizations should be looking at the control of leveraging that catalog, which is a foundational component of implementing best practices for security in the cloud. The second one is classification. It's really the idea that when you're classifying data within your environment, it has to be automated. And of course, it has to be done at the point of creation of that data or ingestion. And it has to be always on. It's not something that you're actually classifying the data once and then you're kind of turning off that process. It's a continual process of actually classifying data that exists within your environment. So you should have a consistent schema and grammar when you're actually dealing with this data and classification of that data across both on-premises and even in your cloud environment as well. And just as I mentioned about your catalog supporting structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data, your classification has to be able to support that as well, because there's risk still associated with sensitive data that's in your unstructured environment as well. So being able to classify that sensitive data in both environments is critical. Leveraging advanced techniques, looking at is there ways to leverage AI and machine learning to actually be able to automatically go out in environments and actually classify data. So you're not there with data stewards having to do it in a manual fashion. Of course, being able to span multiple jurisdictions and deal with multiple languages as well. Because though the United States, we deal with English, in many cases, we might be getting data from other jurisdictions or regions and have to deal with classification of data that's in other languages. And then one of the key components also is when you're dealing with sensitive data is really defining clearly what that hierarchy that exists around that sensitive data. So that's consistent across all your data elements that exist within your environment. So you've defined that clear map of what that hierarchy of sensitivity is, and then all of the data that you classify within your cloud environment can be mapped to that hierarchy. Of course, one of the other controls is the access of sensitive data. You know, entitlements and access for sensitive data is really the idea that it must initially default to the actual creator or owner until it's specifically specified that somebody else should have access to that data. And access of data within your cloud environment must be tracked. You have to know who's accessing that data, especially if it's sensitive within your environment. So one of the key components is you have to do an investigation within your environment and understand what specific roles and what specific users have access to sensitive data. In many cases, in customers that we've dealt with, we've found that sometimes a role or a user has multiple paths to sensitive data. And having those multiple paths to sensitive data actually leads you or exposes you to more risk associated with unauthorized access to that specific data. So what you have to enforce is the idea of a least privileged access model. And that's the idea that people who are going in to access sensitive data, they have the minimum amount of privilege to be able to access the data and do their job. Only that amount. And that gives you the most secure environment for your sensitive data that exists within the cloud. Also, you have to be able to monitor for anomalous access patterns within the data itself. So for example, you might have a user who has the role where he can access some specific sensitive data. And he goes in maybe on 2 times a month and accesses that data. Then suddenly they're going in very, very frequently, accessing that data, downloading a whole ton of data. You have to be able to monitor that, because that could be a red flag that basically indicates that you have somebody who's internal, who's trying to do internal harm to the company, or somebody accesses their password and actually you have a breach associated with it. So it's also not only who's accessing the data, but how they are specifically accessing that sensitive data that exists within your environment. Also a component that can be done as well is looking at data masking. Data masking is the idea that I'm actually leveraging that data, I'm changing the values of that data, the format is still the same, but the value the actual value of the data is actually changed, so the sensitivity of that data is not there anymore and you're not exposed. So you can actually specifically deploy dynamic masking based on the specific roles associated who can access that data. So you might have a user role who can only access mass data versus another role who can access the actual core base data as well. Another one is actually the aspect of security controls, one of the actual controls. You have to put in place specific security controls around your sensitive data. And of course, that security controls that you put in place, you have to record those and keep track of them. This is basically the idea that based on the sensitivity of the data that you have within your environment, you are actually setting up the policies and security around that data based on the sensitivity of that data. And you're basically looking at systems and saying, okay, that system specifically has sensitive data in it, so I'm going to look at the configuration of that system. And if that system starts to go out of configuration, I actually automatically make sure that it's up to date on the latest configuration policies that need to be in place for that system. So you're continually making sure that the systems that contain your sensitive data are protected within your environment. And that's where the aspect of auto remediation using cloud APIs. So if there is a problem, it's automatically changed and the configuration is made whole within that environment. The idea of, also the idea of data masking is also one as well. One other problem that a lot of organizations face, and one of the controls was put in place for, was dealing with this problem of data sovereignty and cross-border transfers of data. Because in a lot of cases, you might have data that exists within a specific jurisdiction, and there are specific regulatory requirements and controls around that data that you must meet, or you expose yourself to fines or legal ramifications associated with that data. So you need specific controls in place to make sure that there's insight into that data that might exist within jurisdictions, or you're actually transferring data across jurisdictions within your environment. And that's another problem that arises as well, and we talked about this earlier, is what do you do when you have two jurisdictions that have sensitive data and they're not able to actually share it? Data masking might be a way to actually be able to remediate that problem. So you need within your environment, when you're specifically looking at the aspect of data sovereignty and where it exists, you have to know specifically the location and residencies for all those data systems that exist within your environment. Does that data system exist within Europe, where GDPR would be in effect? Does it exist in California, where CCPA would be in effect? And you use that as your basis when you're actually setting up the specific requirements, your jurisdictional requirements around your data. Of course, building data maps as well to understand not only where that data is, but where it might flow to downstream systems and how that can actually impact your specific regulatory requirements as well. And also specific, if there is a breach or there is a problem associated with data that exists within a jurisdiction, having the control in place that when you're actually responding to maybe a security breach, that it matches the specific requirements for that jurisdiction. Because you don't want to overreact within a jurisdiction, but you also don't want to underreact when regulatory requirements state that you have to do specific notification associated with data within an environment. Of course, also running a DPIA or data protection impact assessment is also one of the main controls that exists out of the 14 controls in the within the framework itself. The idea is that when you're running DPIAs, they have to be automatically triggered and tracked to all personal data according to the jurisdiction. So the idea of a DPIA is, what is the impact or risk associated with processing specific personal identifiable information within a specific region? And you have to know the requirements associated with that for those specific regions. So you need to know the residency of the data system that the actual data exists in if you're going to actually do a data protection impact assessment, the specific jurisdictions of the data systems, what personal information actually exists in those systems as well, and when there's a need, auto-trigger that DPIA. So now we've touched base on the actual controls. One thing I wanted to now talk about is the company that I work for, Security, and the unified data control solution set that we bring to the market that maps to these controls. So the cloud data management controls, we've actually looked at specifically and said, these are awesome best practices. We have technology and solutions that we want to map to these best practices to meet the needs that organizations have around their requirements for implementing these best practices within their cloud environments. And we've actually have the idea of a unified data controls architecture. The idea is that security, privacy, and governance and compliance have common frameworks and common data that they deal with. So we know that data is massively growing within our cloud environments. We talked about this earlier. Multi-cloud adoption is growing. Data obligations are growing. Why should we be looking at and addressing security, privacy, governance, and compliance as silos with separate systems, separate data repositories, duplications of processes, duplications of nomenclature, the inability in many cases for these teams to actually communicate between each other. So the idea of a unified data controls is fulfilling the obligations of all of these pillars in a unified way. And that's what our solution at Security tries to bring to the table. So what we bring to the market is a solution called the Data Controls Cloud. And it's really the idea, the foundational component of it is called sensitive data intelligence, which is really the idea that you have to be able to, as we talked about earlier in the CDMC, you have to be able to be out into your environment and identify and tag and identify what data in that environment is sensitive. And then out of the platform, the actual platform, can connect to all the native data systems. And in this example here, I'm showing you how we can connect to Google's native data systems. The Google Cloud Storage, BigQuery, Cloud Firestore, etc. Also, the non-native data systems. We can discover those non-native data systems, those dark data systems that I talked about earlier. Somebody spins up an instance, maybe loads an open source version of Cassandra on it, and is doing some data manipulation. You have to know that that exists. We actually have the ability to discover those dark data systems that exist within an environment. And of course, SaaS services, and then of course, all the other cloud providers as well. So we really try to have our data controls cloud as this holistic solution, meeting each one of those platform verticals, the compliance, the governance, security, and privacy needs under a single umbrella, and leveraging that aspect of data insight. So one thing we're not doing is, for example, in your environment, we're not actually pulling your data out of your environment and bringing it to this data controls cloud. What we're doing is we're doing the scanning and discovering of the data there and bringing the metadata, the data about that data, into the data controls cloud. Of course, we actually cover hundreds of types of data systems. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key components is how can you talk a common language across all these, not only the groups, but across all the cloud systems. So that's a problem that we've actually talked with some of our customers, is the AWS guys are talking a different language than the GCP guys who are talking a different language from the Oracle guys. With our specific cloud, what we do is we actually can eliminate that problem and talk a common nomenclature when it comes to dealing with data, sensitive data, and that security across all of them. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the key components is really this idea of sensitive data intelligence and data discovery. So it's really this idea that we cannot do this in a manual fashion. You have to have automated practices that are actually going out and doing all this kind of stuff. I can't do it throwing around Excel spreadsheets. So we've actually built into the Data Controls Cloud the ability for AI to go out there, search and scan. We have these flexible pods that we will actually install within these cloud environments, which do the scanning, can do it at petabyte scale, and bring that metadata back into the Data Controls Cloud environment. So we actually support multiple models, both software as a service, a hybrid, and of course, a sovereign model as well, if you want your specific air-gapped environment. And as I mentioned earlier, we have these elastic pods that we can actually scale within an environment. So we can actually scale and scan petabytes and petabytes of data at scale to discover sensitive data that exists within your environment. And then, of course, we have the Data Controls Console, which enables you to monitor and run the solution across a multiple cloud environment as well. So I am at the end of my time here. So I hope this gives you some insight into the CDMC framework with the EDM Council. I highly recommend that that you look at both the EDMC website as well as our websites as well. We have a number of resources that are on our website. We have some insight into our solutions with our cloud environment. I also, Colin, who is up at the top here, actually has some information. So if you have any other questions surrounding both our solution as well as the EDM Council, CDMC, and what we're doing with it, him and I can answer those questions. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Well, it's that time of day. I think we're heading into a reception. So we're going to just stop. That's it.